What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you a handful of early access titles that I think are worth keeping an eye on. But as always, a few things here at the beginning. For starters, early access by its very definition means unfinished, frankly, which means that these games are not in a complete state, and thus, for the exact same reason that I don't endorse Kickstarters and I simply don't review fully early access games, this is not a recommendation to buy these in any way. In fact, when it comes to early access titles, I think the only time you should really ever buy them is if you are dedicated to being involved in that feedback that they are hoping to get from early access, because while it can be a tool of great success for a lot of developers, like say for things like Hades or Larian Studios with their games, there are also many stories of things not going well, such as just earlier this year, in fact, with Unforetold Witchstone, whose relatively poor performance in early access seems to have caused an investor to back out, and that game was ultimately pulled from the store not even like a month after it had launched into early access. And all of that to simply say you have to be cautious with these things, and to that end, somebody like myself who covers video games for a living is in a good position to do that for you. So I wanted to talk about a few of these games, what I think about them, and how they will hopefully turn into something great, even if they're a little off the mark right now. And before we dive fully into that, just to give a sort of honorable mention here, Path of Exile 2 is going to be entering an early access period. I believe they have it slated for December in particular, and obviously I'll cover that when it does launch. But as it is not technically released yet, I didn't really want to give it a proper spot on this particular video. But with all of that said, let's actually start talking about these early access titles, and I want to kick it off out of the gate with, I would say, probably the most contentious one, which is Greedfall 2. Greedfall 2, being a prequel to the first game, puts you in a sort of opposite role where instead of playing the protagonist from the mainland to the mystical isle with a potential cure for a plague, you find yourself playing the natives of that isle, forcibly shipped back to the mainland as you try to get to grips with things. However, pretty much right away, this game was mired in a bit of controversy. I would say apparently there was some back and forth between the developers and the owners of the studio and everything, and I don't have the full details of that, but from what I understand, it wasn't pretty. And then you have the game itself. Greedfall 2 changed the combat from the original titles significantly. They changed it from a more action-oriented system to a real-time with pause sort of Origins or other early BioWare titles style tactical gameplay, which isn't in itself necessarily a problem, but right now it's that combat system is simply very rough around the edges, which means basically that I think if they can clean up that combat system and respond to player feedback from their initial early access period, then Greedfall 2 might just be able to turn things around and maybe capture what made the first one great. But I admit this one has a lot going against it. But Greedfall 1 was a great title, and hopefully they will be able to turn Greedfall 2 into an equally interesting story. But good or bad, once this game fully releases, you can definitely expect a review for it out of myself. Which brings us to our second entry, which is Banquet For Fools, a CRPG that entered early access not all that long ago, that is largely being developed by a two-person development team who has worked on previous entries as well under the name of Whale Knot Studios. Now, though, I believe they are just Hannah and Joseph Games. Banquet For Fools, however, takes place in one of their previous works' universe, Serpent and the Staglands, and expands upon that a bit, with you tracking down the mystery of a missing village. That is to say, the residents just completely disappeared. And along the way, you're going to be fighting all sorts of interesting things while getting into the nitty-gritty details of the world and universe. And so far, what I've played of this one has been very interesting. Certainly a little indie to be sure, but I love the art style and the things they're trying to do. The real-time with pause combat system that uses a sort of like action bubble to decide what you can and can't attack in that range, plus the spell crafting system certainly makes for a fair few interesting times. And then you have the things like the different races and whatnot, as opposed to the more traditional stuff like elves, etc. Things tend to be a little more dramatic and almost fey-like here against this more dreary backdrop. But as of right now, Banquet For Fools is receiving patches and everything, and they're being very responsive to community feedback because they want to have that development go hand in hand with the community. And what's here in early access is already a ton of fun to play, and I think once they actually manage to pull it all together and get it across the finish line, this will make for an especially interesting CRPG that I'm really looking forward to reviewing, as a matter of fact. Now, number 3 on the list, we have a title that has been in early access for quite some time. This is Cyberknights by the Treese brothers, another small development team hoping to use early access to respond to player feedback, which is exactly the kind of thing the developers have a pretty good reputation for. But Cyberknights is all about leading a team of mercenaries in a cyberpunk world set on doing crimes and, of course, performing heists, all while utilizing turn-based combat. Now, this game does share some similarities with games like XCOM, where you'll be managing a team and also a base that you happen to be working on and upgrading as you go to more properly outfit your mercenaries, but then you also have to perform missions in order to get things like information and just preparation in general done for upcoming heists, all while pursuing the goals dictated by, kind of how you started your adventure and the unique chip that's been embedded in your main character, and that, combined with things like dynamic events, makes for a pretty interesting concept at the very least, and thus far it's had a pretty successful run in early access, which it has been in for about a year, by the way. So I'm looking forward to the full release of this particular one, which brings us to the second from the top, which is Tainted Grail. So Tainted Grail, The Fall of Avalon, to give it its full name, is a large open world RPG that I would say is kind of honestly best compared to like Skyrim in terms of gameplay, set within the tone of a dark reimagining of Arthurian legend based on, of course, things like the board game and whatnot of the same name. Now, this one's also been in early access already for a while and has received some significant content updates since that initial launch, but the gist of it being that we are freed from a prison only to be wrapped up in an elaborate plot involving all sorts of dark fantasy elements, as you might imagine. But what's really striking about this game is honestly just the ambition of it, because while some of it is certainly janky, and I don't think that's likely to go away, it's also a pretty systems-dense title that does a pretty good job of allowing you to build all sorts of different characters that they've expanded upon. The new region even adds more content to let you actually roleplay some of those choices out. I believe they've already added fishing, and they plan to add a host of other systems that will hopefully allow you to roleplay the character that you would like to roleplay. And when you put all of those things together, even in its unfinished state, I do think Tainted Grail has the potential to be something really, really cool once it's done. But it looks to be a bit slow going on this one, and while I will certainly cover any major updates, of course, following hopefully a smooth release, I have a feeling that might not be all that soon, frankly. But it is, nonetheless, shaping up to be neat, which is why I'd recommend keeping an eye on it. Though that does bring us to our final entry, and I would say by far one of the most promising early access titles, barring something like Hades 2, which let's be honest is already amazing. We have No Rest for the Wicked. Now this is an interesting one because on one hand I absolutely see why this game gets mixed ratings, especially because of the things they've chosen to focus on in its early access period thus far. But the bones of something really, really special are already out there with this game's early access release, as it is effectively an isometric Souls-like action RPG type thing that sees you building up and interacting with a town while trying to fight off an unholy plague known as the Pestilence that has re-emerged after 1,000 years. So you've certainly got plenty to do. The combat feels really great, and it unfortunately launched with a few technical problems that I don't believe have been fully fixed, but are doing better for the most part. And as they continue to expand actual story content, I think this game will only get better. However, I mentioned that their focus seems to be a bit off. In fact, in one of its only recent major updates, they added a Crucible mode, which is sort of like a roguelike mode for the game that you can get rewards from and everything, of course, and it just felt like a very strange addition to focus on when they had not actually added fully the rest of the content to the game, which was certainly an odd choice. But realistically, that's also not the whole story here, because one of the reasons I wanted to talk about this video in particular is actually something to do with this game's publisher. You see, No Rest for the Wicked was being published by Private Division. However, the thing is, Private Division just recently got sold, like a day or two ago, to an undisclosed buyer, which obviously puts No Rest for the Wicked in a bit of an awkward position. Now that said, Take-Two is supposed to be still going to move forward with their publishing obligations for No Rest for the Wicked, so I wouldn't consider this one dead in the water. at least not yet at the very least, but it's definitely something to be wary of, especially if you, like me, actually paid out of pocket for it. But with any luck, this game will make it through that and hopefully reach its full potential, because the bones of something really special are in there, like I mentioned, and I hope we manage to see it become something really great, even if it is a bit rough around the edges now, which is obviously why it's in early access. But I think that's as good a place as any to cut off this particular video. With any luck, you enjoyed it. Maybe you have some thoughts about these games or others down in the comment section below, and if that's the case, definitely feel free to shout them out. Which of course means to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.